Go now. Hi.
Thanks, Caleb. Hi, I am Hippie Hacker, and welcome to the Sig Arch Conformance office hours. These meetings are ruled by the CNCF and Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which basically says, be kind and do not be unkind. And this meeting is being recorded for everybody for later. I think it's a pretty simple agenda today. I didn't see anybody add anything except going through the board. So I wanted to make it super easy for us to do so. I've dropped a link to the HackMD so that if someone wants to click the checkboxes as we go along, that would be great. I'm going to be using a way that we organize stuff here at II to kind of pull up some slides based on the same data. The agenda we've gotten through so far is an emotional check-in. And we've got some promotions to talk about, some tests that are in progress, some sorted backlogs that don't have PRs yet, and 15 points worth of triage. We've also got some rewrites in progress and a little update on the website itself. So first part of the agenda, before we started this meeting, we took some time to ask everybody how they're feeling. Because in this season, I think we really need to check in with each other. Feel free to do that one-on-one afterwards with anyone that you know. What we've been up to as a team is increasing coverage and making the gate, because that's what this meeting is about and what we're measured on. What we're planning to do is finish the migration for AWS for the main site, so that all the different members of our community from the corporate sponsors can have a little bit of contribution to making sure that this community runs well. And as far as the II team and our Q1 LKRs that we went over with a month ago, I think we're on task to do that. But again, with the code freeze and other things going on in the world, it'll be a bit slower. Yeah, I think we're still going to get there. This is our promotions. So from this area, I'm going to just pull up the column link for that and go ahead and pull up these three tickets as we go through it. I have to move my video thing out of the way for a moment. Click on here. So this column, I've kind of focused it on Caleb and the column of needs review, and making sure that anything in this column of needs review for promotions is ready and not blocked. So I'm going to go down to the bottom and see where we are. We need to update the release 30 seconds ago. Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. So we have an action on that. Any other comments on this particular ticket? We did a retest this conformance data. I'm going to note that I think this one's gonna merge soon and promote. Our note will be, looks like it will promote soon. And I wish there was a way to log in as a group to comment, co-author that statement, if everybody agrees. Next one is 2 points. We go down and see. Thank you, Aaron, once again. If there's any, it looks like this will merge. Let's make a quick check. We removed a do not merge. And I think we're passing. The tide not mergeable, so now that that's removed, yeah, it looks like this will merge soon. Yay. Hopefully, together with all of these points, we'll get that full amount of coverage for our promotions. So again, we'll go to the bottom of the promotion and check. Thank you again for unblocking us there, Aaron. And again, this should merge soon. Awesome. So just to summarize that, we had 8 points possible for promotion. And I think in general, those seem like they're going to merge. Any thoughts before we go past promotions?
Yeah, a few of those still had, what was it? Needs review and needs looks good to me, but maybe those could be added, or I don't know what the situation is.
Look at the
I
tag.
haven't had a chance to go through those line by line, but like what I don't know off the top of my head is if somebody's had a chance to uh, look at the test to make sure it adheres to our guidelines and stuff, right? I know. So I see you're linking the original test ticket. So when I have more time after this meeting, I will go through and take a look at that. But just for me, the personal thing is like, just because there's a PR and there are no comments on it and nobody spoke up in the past like 30 seconds that we scrolled through the PR does not, to me, imply that somebody has verified that the test is adhering to our standards and stuff. Yeah, but I'll take a look at it as soon as possible.
Yep. Thank you. That's all good.
More feedback. I'm just taking a little note here. We need more. Sorry for the typing. I'm not on the computer I normally use. I'll back those off to our slides again. This is three tests that are in progress. So I'll open the column link and this, and this test. Again, these are the three ones that have create in the title that are in needs review.
Okay, I had an issue with this one, which
Okay.
I haven't had time to comment on the thing, but maybe it'll be faster for us to talk through it here. So,
Okay.
John, I believe that you recommended that we use a delete event to notice when the replication controller got deleted. My concern is conformance tests are not supposed to depend upon events. Most especially, they're not supposed to depend upon the content of events.
We're not looking at events as in the event resource. We're talking about watch. We're doing a watch and we're looking for a delete to come through the watch. On the resource. Does
okay.
That,
that's probably fine. I'm just asking like what others think.
I mean, the original rule was just because people were using events to write bad tests.
Right.
So, like they were using events in a way that was not what events were designed for. But checking that an event was fired and requiring that event to be fired, I mean, there are some limitations there, but if events aren't propagating through the system, that would also be what I would consider a conformance failure. It just may be that not all of the failure modes are obvious to people when they test for events.
well, but am I like completely confused in that events and watch and a delete coming down the watch are completely different things?
They are. And the original reason that people were using events was because they were they were not using watch. And so that was the original don't use events. But it's totally okay to check for events.
Yeah, I believe the rule is, Aaron, that you can look for. Well, I would have to go back and look. There was, because there are some that we're using actual events, but we said you couldn't look for specific messages, for example, in the events. Or I may be mixing up. I would have to go back and look.
Yeah, there's just a lot of confusion because people originally were looking at events and building logic off of how events were fired, which wasn't the intent of events. It was like looking at log file lines instead of using the underlying primitive to verify that the system observed. But it would be totally okay to have a conformance test that expected a certain log line to show up if we could make an argument for it.
This test uses watches to check for the type of event that occurs according to the watch. So in the case of what you were referencing, Aaron, it was when it was deleted. So it's, yeah, that's the kind of area it is for everyone.
Now, so in the case, so I would probably say there's also problems with using watches. If you properly handle the error cases, we have had bugs because people did not understand that failures in watches were actually system level bugs. And so some of the conformance tests that were switched away from using watches were switched to something that no longer actually caught that a fundamental part of the system had regressed. And so this kind of gets into, if you're using a watch, you have to be aware of the potential, the scenarios under which watches can fail in a valid sense, and then retry the test. And so I would prefer in many cases that, like, certainly there'll be people who will come through and say like, oh, you're not supposed to use watches for this. That's actually incorrect. You should use watches, but we need to make sure that they're used in a way that matches. And that's often requires some external knowledge.
Right. And so I'm not intimately familiar with this right now, but I know we have guidance in our in the conformance test guide about you should use in the informer pattern, which I think is like slightly more than a watch, but it does involve a watch.
Yeah, so like a great example of this is the pod graceful termination test was originally written in a way that correctly verified that the sequence of events coming from the API server matched a very specific behavior. At some point, people were like, oh, this is flaky, and they refactored it. And then we actually broke that fundamental behavior and the test no longer caught it. So usually what the informer is shielding you from is dealing with the consequences of a watch. It's possible that what we're missing is a test construct that makes it easier for people to verify a scenario with watches and correctly identifies when the scenarios that would be missed in watches don't occur. So for instance, you're allowed, like if you delete a pod from the API, there's a certain set of allowed events that you're able to see from a watch. So you can see the kubelet, you can see it getting marked deleted, and you might see the kubelet update status, and then you should see the kubelet update the final status, and then you should see the kubelet deleted. If you miss some of those events on a watch, which are totally possible for various reasons because they got compressed or the compaction happened, probably like we still want to verify that that sequence is correct, but it might be that we would run the test several times in a row, which is we say if we didn't observe it, we should run it again and see if we observe it. A bunch of the kubelet bugs like I'm dealing with right now are because we don't have good EDE testing that verifies that invariants of the system aren't violated. And watches tend to show you that. It's not that much different from doing a poll. So in many cases, as you're saying, Aaron, like an informer or just doing a poll, you'd just be checking to see if you don't see any invalid states. But that's also a harder test to write. And I think we struggle with this in a lot of the conformance testing around system behavior versus like the more like replication controllers shouldn't do certain things. We don't have a test that says, put the replication controller through its paces, make sure that it doesn't do any invalid things. We instead test fairly simple things like, oh yeah, I created a pod, great.
Right. That's basically what this does right now. I'm just looking it over, is the simple things of, all right, we patch it, and then we make sure that that ready replicas gets to the right state, and then we delete it and make sure that we get a delete from the watch that the controller, the RC was deleted. We're not really.
The kind of test that I'm advocating for, I actually don't think has to be a conformance test. The conformance test should verify the high level observed behavior to maximize return on conformance. I think the second one is verifying that that the system is doing the right thing under pressure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is whether those things matter to workload portability or not, right?
I mean, it's funny because it's like, so like a lot of what I've been spending the last 6 months on is like places where our core fundamental model is broken. So for instance, for over a year, we had a bug where a pod that if it ran would always fail was reported as successful. And so a job controller that's written on top of retrying failed pods, but not successful pods would break, right? There were edge cases where if you were like, hey, I'll use a job, and I say retry on failure. Oh, the job succeeded, great, my stuff got run. That actually wasn't true. I think given the difficulty in testing that stuff, I think this is a separate discussion, is we should have those tests before we worry about putting them in conformance.
Yeah.
SigNode, we had a discussion today about we actually need to do that for several other things because we've observed more status anomalies in the kubelet and we have regressions and subtle bugs. I would probably say like we want to get that infrastructure in place for testing those in a more coherent manner, and then they would be good candidates for conformance. But like this sort of flow is good. But yeah, in most places where you're watching, you have to be aware. And as Aaron said, you should be using an informer unless if you're trying to get the first version of the test correct, don't get complex with watches and event invariant tracking. We have to go do a better job of having a framework for that before we just expect random, everybody to learn that.
It's good, thanks.
Okay. What I feel like I got out of that for this PR is that we're probably fine with the use of a watch because it's a very simple scenario. We might prefer that we advocate for informers over watches in general to avoid the problems that a watch can cause, but I don't feel strongly enough that that needs to block this PR from being promoted, so long as I can see that this test isn't flaky.
And I think the other thing that Clayton brought up is that we may need some better infrastructure within the testing framework to manage these kind of tests, or to write tests that use watches in a safe way.
Yeah, so I was just doing a quick glance, and there is some prior art for using informers and some for watches, so I'll see how prevalent it is in conformance tests. Thank you for entertaining that discussion for me.
Yeah, and I just, for my own sake, like I want to clarify, like the messages coming down an event channel, or rather, I'm sorry, the messages coming down a watch channel are not necessarily events in the Kubernetes event sense. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct.
Okay, I just want to make sure I wasn't completely confused. Okay.
Terminology should have been renamed. That was
Okay.
We would usually say watch event always. We would never say just event. It's watch events come down a watch channel.
Okay, so maybe useful, Caleb, just to use the word watch event within the context of this PR in your text so that it doesn't cause confusion.
Okay, yep, I can do that.
Are we saying to rewrite the text so that it, or do you want to talk about the PR itself as far as referencing watch events versus events? It's a promotion, so I want to.
The PR already references watch events as far as what it actually uses, the code, but the terminology, so it just says event in like the descriptions and the comments and stuff. And so I think that leads to some confusion.
All right. So the action here is
You muted yourself.
it's torn between typing and talking, and I don't want to hurt it ears
explicitly. Okay. That was really useful. Thank you, Aaron, and for everybody clarifying this. I think I'm going to commit here, and we have an action on that one. Go to the next one. This is create event lifecycle test. This is the PR that has is just looking for LGTMs, I think.
And approved.
And approves, yeah. So far, there was some resolved issues from Aaron and conversation, somebody unassigned themselves. It's basically been Aaron and Bobby, sorry, Caleb. Bobby McBob's Liggett, and you did this? Yep, thank you. And
right, so in the context of our last discussion, so this test is like generating a synthetic event and then making sure that like the life cycle of that synthetic event is okay, which I interpret to be okay because we're not relying on arbitrary Kubernetes components to like send certain events at a certain time. It's just pretty much straight up CRUD on an event.
Yeah, this is actually testing the event infrastructure as opposed to that certain events are thrown off as side effects of other behavior.
So technically, this could maybe fall prey to the issue where like delivery of events is not guaranteed. Events could be compacted out of existence, things like that. But it seems okay to me.
I guess.
I guess I'm curious on your perspective. Like, do you think we should have like a CRUD test on the event resource just to make sure that, you know, it works?
I think we should absolutely test events, the API. We probably should test the reporter. So components in Cube using the client Go recorder library, if they can't send a valid event to the recording infrastructure, then that is not a conformant event implementation. In the sense of, like, we define what the APIs are, but like in practice, if client Go can't send it, if the event sending infrastructure can't succeed, then there's not much point to that API. So I would probably even be in favor of the testing the basic CRUD, and then also having a single test, which is the Kubernetes out of the box default event recorder can send one event. And all of the worries about like event compaction and stuff do not hold for that case, because that's like on the client. The client can batch up and choose to delay if it's overloaded. If you create a specific client and then add the recorder and then send an event, it will go through. Unless the API server is crashing, and if the API server is crashing, your conformance suite's going to fail anyway.
Okay. That sounds good to me. So that sounds like follow-on work, but I think the scope of this PR is good. I will review it more in depth later, but I feel like this will go through.
All right, I'm trying to make sure I type all this in. If I've made mistakes, they're all public. We'll go here to our creating endpoints lifecycle test, plus 5 endpoints of coverage. And I'm just gonna jump down to the bottom and scroll up. There was a comment yesterday.
Yeah, basically it was fine. There was just some, I think, terminology in there that was confusing, in that it uses service when actually these are strictly endpoints. There's no associated service. I don't believe the test creates an associated service. And so this is really just testing the CRUD. It's not testing. So this is another comment that's not on there. It's not actually testing right now that these manually created endpoints that aren't created by the endpoints controller are plumbed through to kubeproxy. So ideally, so the test it does validly hit those endpoints, but it doesn't test the full functionality yet. That functionality is tested in ones that do use the service controller, or rather the endpoints controller. I guess in theory, there's a gap if somebody re-implemented all that stuff that they could break it, but I don't know that that's realistic if anybody else has an opinion. The other thing was the 180 seconds for this test to complete seemed a little bit arbitrary. I wasn't sure where that came from. And, you know, we have other values elsewhere that have been chosen for whatever reason. I guess shown not to be flaky, and I don't know whether that's flaky. So that for context of those listening, the 180 here, this wouldn't work similarly to the RC one in that it starts a watch channel at the beginning and gives a timeout. And so the whole test, and it looks for changes in the resources that are being patched and whatever created and then deleted through that watch channel. So the whole watch has to complete within that 180, the whole test has to complete within that 180 seconds.
So this is actually, thinking about this again, coming at it from the perspective of a test author, I think there's characteristics of the watch cache which are actually flawed in some cases, but I actually don't know that I would consider a cluster conformant. So there's like the flake aspect, which is, network interruptions happen, network is unreliable, Kube API servers might be doing rolling updates while someone's rolling running a conformance suite because the admins are going for bonus points on style. You might have temporary latency delays, but I think all of those could be resolved by the test itself explicitly retrying and then cataloging some of that. It's weird to me because it's like kind of what we're saying when we talk about like watches not being reliable is we're saying we implicitly don't know how to bound the reliability of what we're doing. A clean shutdown on a watch should be interpreted as we can go back and start the test over from the beginning. And if we never complete, that's a serious problem if you can't hold a watch open for more than 60 seconds on a particular cluster. We've never actually tried to state that. So I'm not saying that we should go do that right now in this conformance test. But the general idea of if you make a call to the Kubernetes API to open a watch at a resource version within a certain fixed linear time and you get weirdness, that's a bug in Kube or in the person who implemented Kube. Again, I don't think we have to do it here. We would probably, one way that we might address that is say, as I was saying before, like there's a framework which is given a watch and a precondition, verify that this is true, that retries if the watch closes in certain scenarios and retries up to a certain number of times and says, hey, you've had 5 failures in a row. I'm going to fail this conformance test because we have another conformance test that also says watches should be reliable for 60 seconds, no more than 10% of the time. But until we have that, it's probably premature to do it here. Watches aren't supposed to be unreliable, so maybe this is just us needing to claw our way back into taking control of the problem. I struggle with this. This is one of those, the test infrastructure needs sometimes doesn't like this theory. And maybe we need to come back in and say Sig API machinery needs to have a conformance test that says a watch should be open for 100 or should be able to be open for this set of criteria and this set of criteria. And thus that is a definition of what API machinery considers a conformant re-implementation of both the API server and the underlying data store to provide some consistency of experience for API clients across all cubes.
Right. I'm wary of introducing performance characteristics into conformance, but I totally hear what you're saying.
Yeah. Watch, it's kind of weird because it's watch is if you can't actually watch things with watch, why do we have that API? If your watch is closed after 30 seconds all the time, that might be okay, but then you should be able to resume them. If somebody had an implementation of Kube that compacted every 15 seconds and lost stuff, I actually think to an end consumer, that would appear to be a non-conformant cluster. We haven't defined it as such. So I don't want to, you're right, Aaron, I don't want to overbound it. I'm just as we're talking about this, I'm if I tried to use a cluster that couldn't keep a watch open for 180 seconds, I would file a bug against them. And I would probably come to this group and say, these guys aren't conformant. They need to get in line. If watch doesn't really work, I think you would be non-conformant, in my opinion. But I think that's something that we could do as a process we do not have to do right now.
So there's a separate task that's been on my to-do list for since I started getting involved in conformance, which is to actually document the watch behavior. And so this would fall right in with that. It's not really clearly documented, the behavior, the failure, how we expect failure to happen, what conformance is, exactly kind of what you're saying, what conformance is for a watch. So that's probably something that we can do as a group and get Sig API machinery to give us.
And this actually raises a bunch of other issues because K3S went and did the SQLite backend, and exactly. I know there's a couple of cloud providers that are playing around with non-etcd backends or emulating the API. And so I would want this to be I think it's in the best interest of all Cube users and Conformance if people know what the minimum bar is. If we were to go set the minimum bar today and people didn't do it, we would just need a process for ensuring that they understood how to change it. Like, and I'm not implying that K3S would ever do this, but like if K3S was like, well, we just can't make watch work and we don't want to, I think that's just a separate discussion we could get to. And I'm only picking on them because I know they did the SQLite thing and I think they're crazy.
Well, I mean, but I think part of that has to be not, as part of watch conformance, we have to make sure that we're not making accidental behaviors inherited from etcd as part of the conformance. Like we should be careful about setting that bar you mentioned as low as possible in what we really need out of watch, as opposed to.
And it's funny because Sig API Machinery has explicitly said that they will not take on scope for non-etcd backends. And so it's by doing that, it is like, I want people to be able to write conformant things. I don't want someone not to be able to rely on the client libraries against a cluster that looks almost conformant and then have to deal with the fallout of it. Like
Right.
if I had a properly behaved informer and it was listing every 15 seconds, I'm going to say, I can't, like, this is not standard. Like, this is not how Kubernetes is supposed to work. This is not how Kubernetes was intended to work. And this is not what the SIG would support for a bug. We just send that back and be like, that's a K3, I'll stop picking on K3S. That's a clever person over here's problem, but then that kind of defeats the point of conformance. So John, I'll certainly work with you on that
Okay.
side.
Yeah, great.
There is, for what it's worth, a test E2E API machinery watch.go file that does have some conformance tests related to the behavior of watches.
I've certainly known that I've added them over time. So I think anything that we do as part of conformance should be clearly documented and communicated to stakeholders. And
Yeah.
I certainly not want to push someone's buttons.
Yeah, totally. So like there are timeouts specified in there of like a minute for an event to be delivered and 10 seconds for an event not to show up, but they're not like, they're magic numbers deep in the code. They're not pulled out as constants or anything like that.
Well, in this particular case too, the way the timeout works is you start it at the beginning of the test, and then it's not per event. It's not per watch event. It's like the watch will time out after 180 seconds.
Although I'll say if in 180 seconds you can't complete a replication controller loop,
It's a long
you're
time.
going to have a very unhappy set of users. And I think there is kind of it feels weird to say things like this. I would probably say, yeah, like you have to complete these tests in a reasonable amount of time, and 5 minutes is more, or 180 seconds is so much more time than you need, that if you failed that, I would question your life choices or something.
Well, what I'm thinking about are in our CI, right? And things are heavily
It's tough because
overloaded.
like we had the rules originally because people were definitely abusing events and watch, and watch has gotten better. I think in some cases we were reacting to the wrong problem. We were dealing with flakiness using, the hose because we had to, but now we need to go in with the water jet and be very gentle around the gums as we excise the remaining plaque here.
Dentist analogies, okay.
Just to address why 180 seconds was chosen, I believe this test is at something at or below 60, and it seemed, I just changed it to 180 seconds and it just seemed to do the job. So I totally get that. If 180 seconds isn't appropriate, and well, according to other values which have been set for other tests, then I'd be happy to change it to whatever number. Just let me know where it is.
I don't know if it's appropriate. It sounds like Clayton says, in theory, it's a long time for a normally running cluster. Sometimes our CI clusters get heavily overloaded, and I think when you create the RC, it's pulling some images, but they should be, things are already loaded. Like I don't know. I just wanted to make sure we had looked at other tests to see what they're using, because I figured those values come out of experience.
And I think that's actually a really key thing, which is Although, our CI clusters being overloaded. So we've toyed with this for years, right? Like optimizing the CI environments. We've never actually defined what the minimum requirements to run conformance are. And there are conformance tests that did not run on smaller clusters than right? Like we fixed a scheduler conformance test to be much more resource efficient because it was asking for like 100 millicores and it didn't need to test conformance. Maybe this is another one where we need to describe what the expectations for conformance are and set up the test environments to more realistically mirror that. And then say, we'll try to run close to the floor so that we push the flakes out, but conformant implementations that run more than this could do so. That gets into other questions like you have to have a certain amount of free resources to run the conformance test for scheduling. Does that block someone from running conformance on a K3S single node cluster? Probably. Does it block it on running like on an ARM Raspberry Pi? Yes. Does that mean that Raspberry Pis with less than a certain amount of memory can't be conformant? That's problematic.
So let me try asking the question this way. Again, just glancing through the existing test code base, I feel like there are not that many tests that explicitly set a timeout on their watches. There are lots of tests that set up a watch but don't set up a timeout. Would we be more?
So I asked him to set up a timeout because, well, I guess there's maybe an overall timeout on the test framework on the test, because if you don't set a timeout on the watch,
watches have an implicit 30-second timeout, or sorry, explicit 10-minute timeout if you don't set them. That's probably why we tuned them down. Because you would crash fail and wait 10 minutes. And I vaguely remember Aaron at some point going in and yelling at people for not having timeouts on watches, but it's been so long that I couldn't tell you. Sorry, It's not 30 seconds, it's 10 minutes. That's the API server's default.
Okay.
30 seconds is for normal GET requests.
Like what if we had a defer that like closed the watch explicitly if the test passes or fails or whatever?
concern with hanging there.
Yeah, this was, I think, the watch. So in the cases where this has happened, it's usually been like, there was some edge case. I don't remember the exact details on all these, but like some of them were like replication controller was flaky at one point and would lose creates because of expectation failures. And so as a result, the thing that we're trying to go in frame in conformance now, the replication controllers create pods, at one point would just run all the way to failure. Some of these we did set shorter timeouts so that we would say, if you haven't done it in 180 seconds, you're definitely not going to do it in 10 minutes. Like it was just to get the tests tied in. Maybe that's too aggressive now.
Okay, that's fine. So in the context of trying to move this PR forward, I feel like I would at least like to see that magic number extracted with a comment that explains like why we took the guess that we did. And John, are you requesting that we tune that number up or down or something, or?
No, to me, I just didn't know where it came from. It seemed arbitrary. I wanted to know where it came from.
Okay. There's a constant section up above in the file where there are a bunch of other like arbitrary timeouts, but they do have some explanations about why why that guess was taken. Feels like enough to start with.
Oh, and
Trying to catch up on typing.
To address the first issue which you stated in your comment, John, I believe that service stuff was still in there because the way that I was writing this test was pretty similar to another test, which was some kind of, I think it might have been a service status test. And
yeah, well, I think originally it had a service in it, and then through the reviews we removed the service because we wanted this to be, to narrow the scope to just to endpoints, not to test at the service, not to test at the endpoints controller. We already have tests for that. We already have tests, conformance tests that for services with selectors And so when we are just doing the endpoints resource specifically, we wanted to just use manual endpoints as opposed to ones created by the endpoints controller.
So I'll clean that up per your comment.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I brought up was whether we want to run through the networking side of this so that the existing tests around services implicitly test the Q-proxy, well, they explicitly look for the behavior of Q-proxy or whatever it is, plumbing the network. But the question is, that's always for ones with a selector. Sort of, let's leave that out of this PR. We can talk about it later. I just think it's already essentially tested, but you know, I don't know if I don't know why somebody would do it, but if somebody created an implementation that only read, I don't know, services or something, things with selectors, but it seems loony.
I mean, I certainly catch people doing that sometimes, so it's not completely unprecedented. People make assumptions like, oh, the only kinds of workload controllers in Cube are the ones that Cube defines out of the box. So I don't know that's the biggest problem, though. I would say if we want to do that, we should probably move that closer to the site, as you were saying, John.
Okay. Yeah. We can always extend the test later if we need to.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to hit comment. Wow, that was a good one. We have 10 minutes. I'm hoping we can get through a few. That was our 3 tests. The next part is our sorted backlog. That doesn't have PRs yet. So for some of these, we have our API Snoop ticket, which includes the way that we work to create this. But I'm not going to go through this. I'm just going to open up these 2 pieces here. So this one is the research area for a ticket. So this is in the sort of backlog. I think we're okay I think we already voted that this was okay to do on last time. If we go all the way down, we just haven't picked this one up yet. So it's in the backlog to do. We can look at it again, but we've already kind of approved this one. So I'm going to leave it.
I'd rather not retread old ground if we've already talked.
That's not. And this is how from way back.
We'll come up with a different conclusion this time if we go through it again.
No, just keep going. This is probably left in the backlog, and so that's what we're going to do. We're just still going to leave it. So let's close all that and go back to our pages here. So the next part is triage. This is where we get new tests to write. So let's quickly pull these out so that we can decide if there's something wrong before we write the test. So so that was the other one. So this one is core V1 status stuff. This is the 4 endpoints that it's going to hit. And there's the documentation for it. Before we go into the test, this is the test outline. It's going to create a pod with a static label and patch the pod. We can go into the code, but
don't we already have tests for I mean, we certainly have tests for creating pods, don't we? Like as part of conformance.
But what we don't, so again, this is about the metric we're trying to replace. These 4 endpoints and the way that we calculate coverage are not hit via the EDE test binary. And so we don't have test coverage for these endpoints. So while we do exercise it, they are hit from other components within the Kubernetes system, not EDE tested from our test suite.
I see, because it's the status, specifically the status endpoints.
Yeah. Yep.
The collection one.
Yeah, it seems like the first 2 are status specifically, and then the second 2 are more about listing all pods or deleting namespace pods. I don't know if I would jam all that into one test.
All right. I think they may accidentally hit the other ones. Again, it's the fact that it's increasing coverage shouldn't be the focus. The fact that we chose it is the reason we wanted this test versus writing one that would hit. So if we write this test, it hits all 4. Are we writing it to hit all 4? No, we're testing some behaviors. So think of this as we're choosing the behavior that hits the most endpoints, and is the behavior
Yeah.
that we're testing.
I mean, there's like, so here my question would be like there's already a Sig node test for creating a pod and deleting a pod. And do we just add the status checks into that same test? So we're not adding
that in our notes.
Ones.
So I'm gonna start with our notes. That hit these and update the existing tests.
Well, they do millions of tests to create and create pods, right? But there's actually, I believe, some explicit ones in the node that explicitly create pods, not through any workload controller. And they, so couldn't we just add a check on the status of those same pods so we don't run a whole separate test? I don't know that it matters that much, but.
I think though, this test and a variety of other ones which I've written, which are quote unquote life cycle tests, or rather resource life cycle tests, I think they're valuable to have it testing all of those things in one, because it's just testing all of the general behaviors, all of the CRUD. So I think how you're saying about creating a pod might be useful, if I'm understanding what you said correctly.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm saying is there's already a create and delete, but it doesn't delete by collection. It deletes, I believe, the specific pod. I would have to go look at it, but I think that's a new feature, the delete by collection. So I don't think it does that. So anyway, it's not, frankly, all that critical to me either way. If we want to do it this way as a separate test, that's fine.
Make sure I'm hearing right. There are existing tests that we could look at and update, but it's not critical that we do it that other way. So we may be okay to proceed on this, or do we want to spend the time to?
I wouldn't object to proceeding on this, but yeah, it sounds like Aaron might want a separate test for the.
Yeah, go for it. That's fine.
All right, so I'm going to say action item. We need reviews. So we need what do we need? It's plus. We need our LG TMs and our approves, please. And should I assign that to people here, or?
We need to. The PR needs to get opened up.
Sorry, yeah. Next item is write PR. Yeah. Cool. Thank you for helping me focus on that. That's what we want on each one of these we call them mock tests.
Yeah.
Make sure before we do the hard job of writing the test that we have most of the logic in place. This is very similar. We're hitting patch list. It's not similar, but it's hitting these 3 endpoints. The logic is pretty straightforward. Create a service account, secret, ensure it's patched. The test is fairly, well, it's a little longer, isn't it? We're out of time to go through these 2 concretely. But we create a service account, check it, patch it, find it in the list of accounts, delete it, delete the secret, and then these endpoints get hit by the test. I don't know how to show both the mock, because there's 3 parts to that. There's the written form, the test itself, and then our output for all our status lines in the Go code.
I'm fine moving forward with this.
Okay. Fine with moving forward. Any other votes?
Just a note that, right, you don't really need to, as part of the test, you don't really need to check like the status of the secret, and as a part of the testing, you sort of, there's already separate tests for secrets. So we're looking at the, I mean, obviously you need the secret in order for the whole thing to work, but Just a sort of side note, if you're following what I'm saying, like in other places we watch for that the create of the resource in question happens and the patch happens and the delete happens, etc. We don't really need to follow all that for the secret, other than the implicit, that it happens implicitly for the service account test to work.
That makes sense.
I'm going to comment. Thank you. And we got 1 minute and 3 PRs to go through. I think what we'll do with that is I'll drop these in the conformance channel, and if we can maybe do that asynchronously, that would be great. The last thing on our meeting was to go through and say there's a rewrite in progress that I think maybe we should drop because it was based on increasing coverage based on parameters. And then we're going to be migrating to AWS. We're in progress. The website's down. Please don't stress. There's lots of things in the world that are in motion. And that's the meeting. And I'll give you back 10 seconds. Thank you for being yourselves near me. It's a pleasure.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eddie.
Thank you.
See you all later.
See ya.